It is narrated that in ancient times there lived a judge named Zarin, whose reputation spread far and wide for his intelligence, shrewdness, and wisdom in returning rights to their owners and repelling injustice from the oppressed. He managed this after successfully solving 3 of the most difficult cases he faced. The first case, it is narrated that 2 men lived next to each other. One was kind-hearted, and the other was cunning and deceitful. The good neighbor lived beside his neighbor without knowing his cunning and deceptive nature. One day, the malicious neighbor fell into difficulty and hard times. He found nothing in his house to satisfy his hunger, so he went to his good neighbor's house to ask for a loan. He did not find him there, but his neighbor's wife informed him that he had gone to work in the morning and had not yet returned. The malicious neighbor decided to go to his neighbor at his workplace. While the malicious neighbor was walking on his way, he saw his neighbor returning from work. He stopped him and told him about his difficult situation and asked him to lend him 1,000 dirhams. The good neighbor did not hesitate to lend his neighbor a good loan. There was a date palm tree nearby, and the good neighbor said to his neighbor, "Tomorrow, God willing, I will prepare the 1,000 dirhams for you, and I will wait for you here beside this palm tree." The next day, the malicious neighbor went to meet his neighbor and take the 1,000 dirhams. When he arrived at the place, he found his neighbor waiting for him beside the palm tree as he had promised. The good neighbor had collected the 1,000 dirhams and gave them to his neighbor as promised. The malicious neighbor said to his neighbor, "I will return this money to you after 3 months from now." The good neighbor agreed to that without taking any document from his neighbor to prove it. After 3 months passed, the good neighbor went to his neighbor to reclaim the 1,000 dirhams. But the malicious neighbor denied the 1,000 dirhams he had taken from his neighbor. The good neighbor was saddened by what he heard from his malicious neighbor and said to himself, "We have reached a time when good is repaid with evil, and kindness with ill will." But the good neighbor had heard about Judge Zarin and the strength of his intelligence and shrewdness in stopping injustice and returning rights to their owners. So he went to him to complain about his neighbor. When he stood before him and told him what had happened with his neighbor, Judge Zarin asked one of the guards to bring that neighbor. When the malicious neighbor arrived, Judge Zarin looked at him and said, "Your neighbor claims that he lent you 1,000 dirhams. Is what your neighbor claims true?" The malicious neighbor denied what he heard from the judge and said, "My lord judge, I did not take anything from my neighbor, and I have never borrowed money from him before that, and what he claims is a lie and slander." At that moment, Judge Zarin looked at the good neighbor and said to him, "Do you have a witness that your neighbor took 1,000 dirhams from you, or a document to prove it?" The good neighbor said, "No, my lord judge, but when I lent him the money, I trusted him, and it did not occur to me at the time that my neighbor would deny my right." Judge Zarin felt the truthfulness of the good neighbor's words and thought for a moment. Then he looked at him and said, "If you are truthful in what you say, and you did lend your neighbor 1,000 dirhams, then go and bring me a handful of dust from the place where you gave the money to your neighbor." The good neighbor was surprised by the judge's request, but he did as he was asked and hurried to bring a handful of dust from that place where he had lent his neighbor the 1,000 dirhams. Time passed and the good neighbor did not return, so the judge began to look at the malicious neighbor. Suddenly he asked him and said, "Your neighbor is taking a long time. Do you know why he is delayed and has not returned yet?" Without thinking, the malicious neighbor replied, saying, "That place where my neighbor went is far from here." At that, the judge laughed and said, "Now you have proven to me the truth of what your neighbor claimed and that he lent you 1,000 dirhams." The malicious neighbor became terrified and then said, "How can that be, my lord judge?" The judge said, "If your neighbor were lying and had not lent you anything as you claim, you would not have known the place where your neighbor went to bring a handful of dust from it, for that place is the same place where you took the money from your neighbor." And with that, Judge Zarin was able to prove the right of the good neighbor, and he ordered the malicious neighbor to be imprisoned until he returned the money he had taken from his neighbor. The second case, it is narrated that an old man rode his donkey and went to the market to bring a sack of flour to his home. When he arrived at the market, he bought a sack of flour, and it was heavy. One of the strong men helped him and lifted the sack of flour from the ground and placed it on the donkey's back. Then the man rode his donkey with the sack of flour in front of him and set off towards his home. On the way back, the donkey stumbled, and the sack of flour fell to the ground. The old man was unable to lift the sack of flour and place it back on the donkey's back. While he was in this state, a strong young man passed by, but he was insolent and foolish. He looked at the man and said to him, "What are you stopping here for, old man?" The man said to the young man, "I went to the market and bought a sack of flour, and while I was returning home, the donkey stumbled, and the sack of flour fell to the ground, and I could not lift it back onto the donkey's back. The young man said, I can carry that sack and put it on the donkey's back again, but what will you give me in return? The old man said, Nothing. The young man carried the sack of flour and placed it on the donkey's back. Then the old man rode behind the sack of flour. When he was about to leave, the young man said, Where are you going, old man? The man said, I am going home, my son. Then the young man said, And where is what you promised me? The old man said, I did not promise you anything. The young man with bad manners said, You are lying, old man. The old man said, My son, I do not understand what you mean by these words. The young man said, When I lifted the sack of flour from the ground for you and asked you what you would give me in return, you said, Nothing, and I want the nothing you promised me. The old man was surprised by the young man's words and wanted to explain to him. He said, When you asked me for compensation, I had nothing with me to give you, so I told you nothing. The young man said, That is not my concern, and you must give me the nothing you promised me. The man stood perplexed and said to the young man, My son, how can I give you the nothing I promised you? The young man said, I told you it is not my concern, and I must take what you promised me. There was nothing for the old man to do but go to Judge Zarin so he could look into this matter and relieve him of that young man. The old man went with the young man to Judge Zarin. When they stood before him and told him their story, Judge Zarin was surprised by this story. He looked at the old man and said, You, sir, promised the young man nothing in return for carrying the sack of flour onto the donkey's back. The old man said, Yes, my lord judge, that is it. Then he looked at the young man and said, And you now want the nothing that old man promised you. The young man said, My lord judge, that is it. At that moment, Judge Zarin knew that the young man was characterized by insolence and foolishness. He thought for a moment, then ordered one of the guards to bring the donkey with the sack of flour into the courtroom. Those present were surprised by that, and no one knew what the judge intended to do. But the guard went and brought the donkey with the sack of flour and stopped it in front of the judge. Then the judge looked at the young man with a challenge and said to him, Young man, if you want to take what the old man promised you, then take the sack of flour off the donkey's back and put it on the ground. The young man did as the judge asked and took the sack of flour off the donkey's back and put it on the ground. Then the judge said to the young man, Now, lift the sack of flour from the ground and put it back on the donkey's back again. The young man did as the judge asked and lifted the sack of flour from the ground and put it on the donkey's back. Then the judge said to the young man, What did you find under the sack of flour when you lifted it from the ground and put it on the donkey's back? The young man said, Nothing. At that, the judge laughed and said to the young man, Then take it, for this is what the old man promised you. And with that, Judge Zarin was able to make the young man taste the same cup from which that poor old man had drunk. The third case, it is narrated that a man had 3 sons, and all 3 sons had the same name. Before their father passed away, he wrote a will in which he said, Zaid inherits, and Zaid inherits, and Zaid does not inherit. When the sons read this will, they were surprised by what was written in it and looked at each other in confusion, not knowing what their father meant by this will. The brothers kept wondering who was the Zaid who would not inherit, as all 3 brothers bore the same name. But they knew that their father intended to disinherit one of them. The brothers found no solution but to go to Judge Zarin so he could look into their matter. When they stood before the judge and told him their story, the judge said, Do you have this will with you? The brothers said, Yes, my lord judge. Then they took out the will and gave it to him. When Judge Zarin read that will, he was surprised and said to himself, What did their father mean by this will? He thought for a moment until he suspected that one of the brothers was not the son of this man, but he wanted to prove it definitively. After deep thought, the judge asked the guard to take the 3 brothers out of the hall and then bring them back to him one after another. The guard did as the judge ordered and began bringing the brothers into the hall one after another. When the first Zaid entered, the judge said to him, Zaid, the judicial panel has thought a lot about this case, and we have found no solution but to exhume your father's grave so we can match his fingerprints, for perhaps this will was forged. Do you agree to that? Zaid said angrily, No, my lord judge, I do not agree to this matter at all, and I cannot see my father insulted before my eyes after his death, no matter the cost, and I do not want anything from this inheritance. And I will give up my right to this inheritance to my brothers. The judge said to him, Then leave now and wait outside the hall. Then the judge ordered the second Zaid to enter the hall. When the second Zaid entered, the judge looked at him and said to him, Zaid, the judicial panel has thought a lot about this case, and we have found no solution but to exhume your father father's grave so we can match his fingerprints, for perhaps this will was forged. Do you agree to that?" The second Zayd also did not agree to this matter and said to the judge, "I do not want anything from this inheritance," and he also wanted to give up his right to the inheritance to his brothers. The judge said to him, "Then leave now and wait outside the hall." Then the judge ordered the third Zayd to enter the hall. When the third Zayd entered, the judge looked at him and said to him, "Zayd, the judicial panel has thought a lot about this case, and we have found no solution but to exhume your father's grave so we can match his fingerprints, for perhaps this will was forged. Do you agree to that?" At that moment, the third Zayd said, "If it is necessary to exhume my father's grave, then there is no problem, and the living are more deserving than the dead." At that, the judge knew that this Zayd was the one meant in the will, and that he was not one of the sons of that man. If this Zayd had been his son, he would not have agreed to exhume his father's grave because of money. And with that, the judge was able to know which of the brothers was not the son of that man. After that, Judge Zarin became famous for the strength of his intelligence and insight among the judges of his era. And everyone knew that a judge who possesses intelligence, shrewdness, and wisdom can distinguish between the oppressor and the oppressed, and that the oppressor cannot deceive the wise judge and cannot escape punishment. And with that, the oppressed person was able to reclaim his right. And finally, write to us in the comments which of these cases you like the most.